Hey, hey, Changemaker! Welcome to Rethink Social Change Podcast, a show dedicated to helping social change practitioners improve the way they make change happen to achieve tangible and sustained impact. I'm your host, Ratiba Sharif. I've worked with some of the world's leading social change organizations for more than 2 decades on 4 continents to help them design better projects, learn from them, and measure their results. Using Rethink Social Change cards, I will challenge changemakers like yourself to share their experience on what worked, what didn't, and why in a very unique way. I will shuffle the deck of 54 Rethink Social Change cards and randomly draw 4 cards that will guide our conversation. So if you're ready for unscripted, jargon-free stories from the field, let's dive into today's episode. He's a true visionary and catalyst for change who's been reimagining civil society for some years now. I'm thrilled to have Charles Kojo Vandyck on the podcast. As a founding member of the International Consortium on Closing Civic Space, ICON, led by the Washington, D.C.-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, Charles has been blazing trails in reshaping citizen participation in Africa and beyond. Through his ongoing work at WACSI, the West Africa Civil Society Institute based in Accra, Ghana, where he heads the Capacity Development Unit, Charles and his colleagues are contributing to rewriting the rules for civil society. They're developing strategies to strengthen the financial sustainability of civil society, tapping into local philanthropy with initiatives like Giving for Change, or championing indigenous leadership. I got to know about his work through the Reimagining NGOs initiative, RINGO. They launched 8 prototypes that challenged some of the major structural barriers to change that exist within international NGOs. From untying aid to northern CSOs to utilizing AI technology to address key barriers to system change through language and more inclusive communication. He also hosts Alternative Convos, a podcast at the intersection of social cohesion and social change in Africa. I'm so looking forward to seeing what cards will be drawn to guide our conversation. Let's have him join us. Charles Kojo Vandyck, welcome to Rethink Social Change Podcast.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be on your platform, Ratiba.
Yes, you're very courageous. I gave you a challenge and you said, okay, I accept the challenge. Let's go for it. Let's see what cards come up. So for you and then new listeners to the podcast, I'm just going to explain a little bit. So these cards are called the Rethink Social Change cards. I designed them in 2016 and they're 54 cards split into 7 categories. And essentially what I did is distill a social change program into words. And these words are aimed to trigger thoughts, reflections, ideas, tease out tacit knowledge that we all have inside, etc. So that's what when I developed the cards, the reason I developed them, and then now I've been using them to, I draw 4 cards, and these 4 cards guide our conversation. The idea is that you apply these cards and what thoughts they trigger, they bring up to your work. I did a short intro. Could you tell me, Charles, a little bit about anything exciting that you're working on right now while I shuffle the cards and select them?
Okay. There's a project called Shift the Power that we're working with Comic Relief and FCDO. I mean, FCDO is the equivalent of USAID in UK. And the uniqueness of the project is that we are supporting organizations in Ghana. We're working with an organization called Star Ghana Foundation, which is also a very unique organization because it was a multi-donor basket fund, and now it's a national foundation. So we're working together to strengthen organizations who work on very important catalytic issues in Ghana, strengthen their sustainability, and also their resourcing, etc. So for me, it's very exciting because we're doing it from a shift to the power lens. And so it's very much a different way of doing capacity strengthening It's more of capacity strengthening through a participatory co-creation kind of methodology.
Process,
So
yeah.
that's one exciting project I'm really excited about.
That's very good. Excellent. So I've got your cards, Charles. All right. So we have 4 cards.
Yes.
The first one I give you, it's a context card. So we're talking historical context.
Okay. Nice.
So think about historical context, some of the narrative, significant events that have shifted dynamics.
Right.
Okay. So historical. I have, as a resource cost, I have budget, so funding, essentially.
Okay.
Okay, so it's money available to implement social change, right? To bring about social change.
Right.
We have the card diversity.
Right.
Okay, so here is intentional differences or not of key elements, stakeholders, context, etc. And then we have sustainability, sustainable. Okay, so I'm going to repeat the word. We're placed in a historical context, or we can tap into the historical narratives and constructs in our reflection.
Yeah.
The second one is the funding, the budget, what's available, the pot of money that's available, essentially, diversity and sustainability.
Okay. Interesting.
So, yeah. Tell me, do the words actually bring up ideas or projects that you worked on or discussions that you've been a part of?
Definitely. Most definitely.
Okay. So you can start wherever you want with any point, and we'll just kind of start, weaving all of it together.
Beautiful, beautiful. Let me start with historical context, because I think history is really important because it kind of shapes the future. One of the things that is happening now, which I think is amazing, which was very different from when I first got into the sector, was a much more intimate, much more deliberate conversation about how we could strengthen the whole international aid kind of architecture, right? When I got into the sector, it was a very much dependency-driven sector. It was basically those of us on this side, and you will be familiar with this, Ratiba, receiving aid from those from the global north. It was about high levels of poverty, and there's still high levels of poverty, and high levels of inequality, but the focus as a lot was on the deficits, was on the gaps, was on the things that we didn't have, supposedly. What has happened, and I think COVID has been a game changer, because I think COVID will go into history as one of the most important catalytic events, because it brought certain things to the surface. And I think one of the key things it brought to the surface was that civil society in this part of the world has evolved beyond the NGOs. The civil society in this part of the world is diverse. Civil society in this part of the world is robust. Civil society in this part of the world has grown, because we saw that in COVID, when many of the INGOs and other international agencies were unable to do some of the work in communities, were unable to access these communities. It was the local organizations that did the work. And how did they do the work? They did it excellently. I mean, they did it with so much passion, so much conviction, with focus, and we could see what happened. So the issue is not necessarily about capacity. Of course, we all can be better, or capability, but the issue is that we've never been recognized as having such assets, because the determination of assets was always based on money and where money flows, but not necessarily expertise or our local knowledge or our networks or the way we did things, or the way we governed, or the way we managed our communities. So I'm really excited now, because the conversation on reimagining INGOs, decolonization, locally led development is kind of flipping that script. It's basically saying, wait a minute, we have a whole ecosystem. And it's not just about global north, but there's global south. And we are just not dependent recipients, but we are actually active participants in the work that we are doing. So for me, this is an important evolution that is taking place. So as you can see, but what's happening in many of the major donor countries is that there's now a question mark about whether funding should go to their own organizations or funding should be made available broadly for everyone, and so that they could also access it directly without going through some sort of intermediary or some sort of global north INGO or facility, which for me is a major game changer in terms of our history.
Yeah, so I've seen it and I've been observing it. In some instances, Kojo, so there's a lot of reports, a lot of research and studies done to really provide the evidence for those inequalities or inequities in process, but also in mindset and in envisioning the role of those actors locally. But so then, Charles, so you've mentioned how during COVID played this kind of leveling the playing field a little bit because locally there's only indigenous local NGOs, right? Indigenous leadership and indigenous groups that were very agile, knew the culture, so they could navigate it more swiftly. So, but what then is missing? Why have donors, or they are still funding quite largely INGOs? Yes. What's missing in the discussions that you've been privy to or a part of? What's missing from local NGOs and local civil society that would actually completely flip the game?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the things that is also two things. There's the perception of capacity deficits, but there's also the inability of local organizations to assert themselves. The confidence to say, we can do this and we want to do this our way. It's been difficult. And also because a lot of us who are working in this part of the world are responding to live events. There are things happening rapidly around us. There's so many humanitarian challenges. So we don't really have time to pause and reflect and sometimes invest in adequate capacity building in terms of leadership, in terms of planning, forecasting. So sometimes there's a certain perception that, if you say we should shift power, can you manage the responsibility that comes with that power? I think that's the perception that we don't have the capacity. What I'm saying is that perception may not necessarily be founded on evidence. If you look at the evidence in terms of capacity and delivery and how organizations are growing, you can see that a lot of our organizations are actually becoming much stronger. A lot of our organizations have now built a certain amount of a track record. They deliver, they have the expertise. The challenge has always been resourcing. And the resourcing challenge is the independence of the organizations to prioritize what is important to their communities, right? So these are some of the challenges. So one of the things I tell INGOs is that if you want to keep on being relevant, you need to understand that things are changing. So you need to reimagine your role. So the idea of you still becoming direct implementers may not be the most sustainable role and relevant role for an INGO. You need to look at how you can become enablers, brokers, facilitators, or even providing capacity support for local organizations who are very familiar with the terrain and are now quite capable to go out there and do the direct delivery, right?
And so Charles, it brought to mind, as I was hearing you, listening to you speaking, it brought to mind what have been some of the obstacles to civil society getting the funding and being able to? Oftentimes it revolves around what I've been hearing is they don't have the robust
Systems.
budget management processes. The procurement processes are sometimes skewed or money is diverted, etc. So I don't think, strategy, context knowledge, and innovation in terms of approaches has been put as the main issue. The main issue for me has always been in terms of operational processes, operational structures put in place, etc. And I know, so, I mean, if civil society in the global south has come a long way in the last 10 years in terms of professionalizing itself, etc., which is good. And that was also thanks to NGOs who subgranted these local civil society and brought the capacity up in some level. Yes. So I wanted to talk a little bit with you between of that fact, like what are we always hearing, or what do you still hear in those discussions regarding processes, operational processes, and transparency and accountability, those kind of
those concepts. Are very, thank you, Rethink. Those are very pertinent issues. So I still hear that we have a huge accountability challenge, and that I cannot run away from. There's an element of truth to that. When it comes to reporting on, especially financial reporting. And also there's been issues with systems and structures to actually attract the kind of resources that are needed. I think some of the challenges there, yes, has been to some extent capacity, but also I think the lack of recognition that organizations are different and operate differently. And maybe what should be done is to, is to find a different way of assessing different types of organizations. You can't expect an informal association to have the kind of systems and structures that the organization I work for, West Africa Civil Society, will have. You can't expect that. They operate in a different terrain, a different form. They do things very much differently. They are very nimble, very responsive. They are direct in the communities. So their system may not live up to your kind of, bureaucratic or institutionalized system. But does that mean they are not transparent or accountable? These are questions we need to ask ourselves. Are we also opening up avenues to co-create reporting standards, co-create accountability standards with the partners that we work with, right? And agree that this is how we would be accountable because it aligns with our strengths and our capacity. So I don't think it's just a blanket kind of challenge where everyone is having a challenge with accountability or reporting issues and it's very pervasive. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's very contextual, especially because right now a lot of donors are trying to support organizations, especially grassroots organizations. You can't take the standards that you use to support urban-based NGOs with grassroots organizations and expect that they will meet those standards. It will be very difficult for you to fund them, right? And so there needs to be a little bit more innovation, more simplicity when it comes to reporting, when it comes to requirements. There needs to be more co-creation of accountability systems. And it involves much more intimacy and in-depth conversation. And I think that's where sometimes the challenge is, because it looks a little bit more resource intensive. And so it becomes quite challenging for a lot of the institutional funders and the NGOs to kind of reimagine and change things.
Yep. It's this co-creation that you're talking about, a real genuine conversation, two-way conversation, where you really listen to what the other has to say. So you talked about diversity in terms of
the NGO structures, from all the way from like grassroots association to capital city-based NGOs. So then, would we then imagine? Could we then imagine different funding mechanisms at
Absolutely.
different levels? Because I know that you've worked quite a bit on the sustainability of financing of CSOs, right? And
Absolutely.
oftentimes, Charles, there's this competition between NGOs, including in the global south. Yeah, right. We're positioned in this kind of situation where it's kind of a win or lose, a zero-sum game, when it's not. And so this competition for funding makes the mindset of the management of those local NGOs very money driven, funding driven. So that's one thing. So the competition is not healthy, because that competition, it could be harnessed for a positive multiplier effect, because each NGO has a different facet and can bring about converging and adding to a project, because no social change issue that we're tackling right now in anywhere in the world is so unifaceted. It's multifaceted. The variables are huge. You cannot work on education without working on access and transportation and safety and inclusion, etc. So you need a lot of. So instead of creating this competitive environment, let's create, find funding mechanisms that create a synergetic kind of environment. Any thoughts on that? It's just ideas that came through.
No, it's brilliant. It's brilliant, Ratiba. And this is something that I've been passionate about, and colleagues who I work with at WACSI have been very passionate about sustainability. And I think the conversation about sustainability is sometimes so much driven by finance. But finance for us is the outcome of every other thing. So the issue really is about identity. What is your mission? What's your relevance? Are you connected with your constituency? The issue is also about how you do your programming. The issue is also about your governance and leadership in terms of your transparency, your accountability, the kind of systems that you've put in place to advance your organization's objectives. I have seen that when these three other aspects of sustainability are strong, what happens is that the resources find you, right? And the resources are not always funding. It could be human resource, other types, infrastructure, other types of resources, right? And so I think one of the most important things that a lot of donors, institutional funders have to understand is that if you're supporting an organization, you can't just support projects. And that's been the danger, that's been the challenge, right? The projectization of the work we do. You need to support the holistic sustainability of an organization, which includes core funding, right? Which includes the people, the vehicle, the infrastructure that is actually going to sustain and deliver on the project and sustain and deliver on the impact that that project is going to make. So having funding where it's just project funding does not help. Funding, there must be core funding, but beyond core funding, there must be other specialized type of funding. So for example, sustainability grants. How are we supporting organizations to be able to diversify their various streams, but go beyond diversification and look at how they can generate and sustain the work that they do through other means, even
Absolutely.
local philanthropy, right? Through maybe the diaspora, through monetizing their expertise, through various means of building assets, so that they're just not dependent on traditional donor sources. I think this is the direction, and this is where the conversation should be. Because one thing that I've noticed is that the resource conversation, if it's just about writing a proposal and waiting for donors to support, what will happen is that we'll never be able to meet the demands and meet the issues within our community. Another thing is that we need to see our communities as potential resources. This idea that, oh, we are working with poor communities, they don't have resources, they can't help themselves, I think just is not true. That's what I've seen in many communities is that they are willing to participate and they're even willing to give resources for an effort that they believe in and that you are driving if they believe that they are part of the ownership of that process. So that is why we at WACSI always say that, look, focus on strengthening your identity, focus on strengthening your operations, focus on strengthening your programming, and then the financial resources will be added onto you. And we always say this because we say, look, people are looking for credible partners. People are looking for an organization that is working with communities and actually making a difference. Resources will not be your challenge, but your challenge will be ensuring that you are continuously relevant and evolving and innovating and responding to the challenges of the time. I think that's where the focus should be. Value. We should ask ourselves as CSOs is what value do we have with those that we say we are representing? Where is that? Are we harnessing the power of those communities, or we are busy chasing donors? This is where the challenge is.
No, true. But Charles, a couple of things came up. One is the systemic discussion that we have to approach funding or the problems in a systemic way. And yesterday I was listening to a webinar from Transcap. So it's they look at systemic investing, where they say, let's not focus on getting the money, let's focus on what the problem at hand is, and then find the best funding mechanism that will help address that problem. And we can get that funding from different sources: private capital, bilateral donations, local philanthropy. So to each problem, there could be different various funding mechanisms that could be put in place. If you look at it as a portfolio, right, as a systems problem. So that's interesting, and it really echoes what you've just been saying about the approach and where we should be taking the conversation. Now, coming back to your idea, which I adhere to, focus on your brand, on your value add as an organization, on your systems and operational systems, so to speak. The thing, Charles, is that for local NGOs, you need funding to be able to do that. So for you to become to have that kind of experience and to be able to showcase that, to have the systems in place, to have a strong brand and identity, etc., and demonstrate your value add, you need funding to get there. So then as you were speaking, I was thinking about, how they do for entrepreneurship or social entrepreneurship incubators, that we could have incubators for civil society. So any civil society project could be actually a social enterprise.
Absolutely.
And so we could have incubators to allow them. So, you need seed money to develop the concept, the value add, why this idea and why do you want to work on that? But then you have some, how do you call them? Business angels, right?
Yes.
Those could be local philanthropy, like through local philanthropy, local donations or diaspora donation. So that you can
private sector foundations.
Or private sector foundations, exactly. And so you can accompany them for those 3 years that are necessary, minimum 3 years, to really get some funding, try things out, and sustain your processes.
Yeah.
And then you could have it at entry level, so a new youth association that's starting, and you want to professionalize it, and you can have it at a kind of a higher level where you have an NGO that's been functioning on the ground for a few years, but it just needs kind of to iron out a few things structurally, systemically, strategically. So those are ideas, as you were talking, that I was thinking about.
No, we need that. Just like startups, I'm sure you're familiar with the kind of support that startups get. That is what has been missing with many CSOs, because the focus has always been on the projects. A lot more of us were focused, donors and others were focused on project delivery. They can deliver on the project forgetting that it's actually a vehicle that's taking you to that destination. If that vehicle's tires get punctured or the engine shuts down, how would you get to that destination? And so I think the focus needs to be flipped now, where there's more attention on building those organizations to be able to deliver. And that's some of the work that we do at WACSI. So in a way, WACSI in a way acts as an incubator to support organizations to really grow, but to grow not in the way we think they should grow. And that's one thing I want to emphasize: to grow according to how they want to grow, and not try to, institutionalize them in a way that will take away their unique identity and their ability to deliver. And so we are very careful about how we work with different organizations. The way we work with a typical NGO will not be the same way we work with a movement.
Yeah.
Because they're just totally different. So we always come from a position of a demand kind of driven participatory approach to capacity strengthening, where we ask our partners, how do you want us to strengthen you? Because then it's more of a participatory approach, and it's driven by their own priorities, instead of being prescriptive and saying, oh, these are the international standards, these are how things should be done, this is what CARE International does, this is what Oxfam does. No, I think for me that doesn't help organizations in terms of their identity.
Yeah. So Charles, I mean, I know the directions that we're all pushing towards, and even some voices in the global north are also pushing for this kind of going more local, using local knowledge, indigenous leadership, etc. You said it's important to sit down with history a little bit to be able to kind of move forward, not to forget history, etc.
Absolutely.
So in that conversation, because I know that in the decolonization of aid, decolonization of evaluation, all of the things that we're hearing right now, there is this sense of moving away from that historical heritage, that heritage of colonization, right?
Yeah.
In both mindsets, in language, in terminology, as well. A lot of bias just in language and the words that are used. So tell me what is some of the resistance that still exists in those conversations around decolonizing of aid? There were a few initiatives of going local, of donors focusing on local funding, etc. The new partnership initiative of the U.S. government, the USAID was one of them. In the humanitarian field, there was the grand bargain.
Grand bargain,
yeah. So there was this kind of move. But all these initiatives have been doing a bit of research, a little bit looking at what come out of them and some of the outcomes and impacts of those initiatives. They tend to die down. Or maybe they die down because there is a new approach or initiative, a new way, and maybe this decolonization discussion was made possible because of those initiatives.
Absolutely.
And they played their role. They weren't there to be sustained. They played their role, and they just opened up a new way of thinking and doing business.
Yeah.
So just wanted to have your thoughts about that, where we're going and what has history taught us.
Yeah. The one thing you know about history is that it tends to repeat itself. So the challenge, I think, with colonization is really understanding to what extent has colonization influenced the aid. A lot of us are talking about decolonization, doing research, and one of the things that we see is that it's a very systemic challenge. It's not just about policy, but it's also about practice and ways of working. People are used to a certain way of working. People have grown up with certain perceptions. We have in all these things issues of structural racism. Some of these conversations are very difficult for a lot of constituencies. Really opening up and really looking at this monster, colonial, the colonial history, or the colonial hangover, and the impact of that on everything that we do, even the impact on our education system and the way we think. For me, it's a challenge that we need to keep on pursuing. One of the things I've noticed about some of these things is that when you don't have champions, or when you don't have a collective who keep on bringing these issues to the agenda, but going beyond that, preferring alternatives, challenging the status quo in a very sustainable way, that's going to die down. People ran out of steam because they got fed up, because they thought that, look, we've been talking about these issues, we've been in spaces campaigning, but it seems like the powers that be are reluctant to release that power, or are reluctant to make the change happen. So for us who were Ringo and other kind of movements like Shift the Power, we know that we are fighting an uphill battle. We are fighting also against cynicism, right? We are also fighting against a lot of historical, historical hangovers in terms of the work that others done. That people feel that, look, we were part of these movements, and what really happened. So there's a lot of that we are fighting against. But there's one thing that I would say, which I think is changing. I think what is changing is that a lot more people, or a lot more of us from the global south, have been able to now work within global north organizations and are becoming champions from within. And one thing I've noticed, a system only changes from within. Yes, you need the pressure from outside, but you also need allies from within. And so I think the difference now is that we are building so many allies from within. That is why, Ratiba, you will notice that this conversation since 2020 has reached a very high crescendo. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere. I've never seen in the history of civil society where there's been so much conversation about reforming the aid system. I've seen it before. And it's because I think the strategy now is working, which is building champions from within, and also putting pressure from outside. And I believe that things will change. And actually, things are changing. I'm sure you heard about what has happened in Sweden with their International Development Corporation. They just made an announcement that from 2025, they're going to open up funding for all organizations, no matter where you are, to access this funding. Of course.
The Swedes have always been at the fore, right?
Yeah.
They're been the precursors of many movements.
Yes. I don't think like 5-10 years ago this would have ever happened. I don't think people saw it coming. I don't think Swedish organizations who are involved in international cooperation are very happy about this, because a lot of their funding will be cut, a lot of their agreements, and it will become, the competition, level playing field. It will become quite challenging for many of them in terms of what the role that they are supposed to play, the impact on their organizations. There's so many things that's going to happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And donors are more. Sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, so things are happening, and we are actually creating history. And 10 years from now, I think the conversation by a lot of people will be, what happened now that has actually changed things? Yeah.
Yeah, you seem very hopeful. I am very hopeful. I can see it. There's still, I think, donor countries will come to it at a different pace. The Swedes kind of were the first to kind of jump in. Others will come. The conversation is much bigger because of the economic repercussions on the country itself, right? The jobs. I mean, it's a reality, right? And as you said, there's this opportunities for INGOs to really revise or rethink how they contribute, and their new place within this chessboard that's shifting constantly. And I think there's room there for innovation and kind of opportunities that are much wider than the ones we seem to think just because we're so attached to what has been
I
the
agree with
system
you.
for so long.
I agree with you.
So as much as, in the global south, NGOs and civil society need to come up with innovative kind of synergetic interventions and value adds and brands and things like that. I think INGOs will have to do the same because the whole table is shifting. The whole table is shifting.
The change is happening, and I keep on saying this. It's inevitable. Something happened in 2020 that it could be COVID, but it also could be the Black Lives Matter. It could be something happened that shifted things, and I feel INGOs need to quickly, turn around and reimagine their roles to sustain their relevance, because a lot of them, if they don't do that, they're going to be very challenged from 5 to 10 years to come.
Yeah. And so, Charles, because, you were talking about internal push, and I completely agree with that, internal push and external pressure, right, for change to really happen. In terms of external pressure, there's no bigger external pressure for those INGOs than funding, right? So their relationship with donors. How have you been having conversations with those donors yourselves?
Yes.
At Ringo, or even in other conversations on decolonizingaid, and what's their stance and how what's their position?
Yeah. So Ringo, we have two interesting platforms: the funder action pod and the INGO board action pod. So the action pods are like a community of practice where we have conversations. Conversations around the systems and structures of the aid system and how to make it more equitable, etc. So with the conversations with donors, we've had some great, amazing conversations with different types of donors, especially private foundations, on different things like accountability, on resource flows, on support to civil society. So different types of donors. And you would see that from the private foundations, they are making moves to change the way they fund their partners. They are making moves to look at how they curate partnerships. And I think there's a lot more flexibility when it comes with the private foundations. It's a little bit more challenging with the bilaterals, who are more within the government machinery. But even with the bilaterals, the fascinating thing is, for example, FCDO, the Foreign Commonwealth Development Organization of UK, they approached us, WACSI and Bond, to facilitate an engagement, a civil society engagement, a global one. They are developing their new civil society program and civic space program. And so we did this engagement. Some of it was in person, some of it was virtual. They allowed us to basically shape the direction and the methodology. There were certain questions they wanted to know, some about funding, some about supporting networks, some about supporting organizations that work in very restricted environments, some, about partnerships. And for me, the difference with this was, back in the days, they would have just called a meeting or sent out a survey. But this time they realized that no, we can't just do this. This is not going to cut it. Okay, you need to work with organizations who have a constituency, who can get the best out of the constituency so that we can actually support the work that they're doing. So even with organizations like FCDO, they're doing things differently. USAID, with its locally led development initiative, even though it's challenged, is also doing things quite differently. We have private foundations coming together and making a pledge that they're going to fund more directly. And this is why I was saying, Ratiba, 5 years ago, these conversations I don't think would have ever been happening, right? And so for me, I always say the change is happening. It may not be happening in a very quick or so should I say vivid way that some of us want, but the change is happening. The things that we've been doing, the background, all the work in terms of engagement that all others have been doing For example, the Pledge for Change, Ringo, Shift the Power movement, all that is actually bearing some fruit. I think now the challenge is, how do we organize ourselves in the global south? How do we organize ourselves in a way that keeps this momentum going, so that we can see the actual changes that we want to see? So that's the challenge to us in that global south, because we should be up and doing. We should, if we say a certain system is not working, we should have alternatives, and we should be confident about those alternatives. So these are some of the things that we are working on. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really nice, and I think the movement has started, and it's just a question of kind of joining the different movements in South America, in West Africa, in Central and Southern Africa, etc. So I think it's going to happen. Technology hopefully helping as well. Now it's offering so many opportunities for real conversations to happen. As you said, COVID created that, right? We were so reluctant to have those kind of meetings, and we had like whole conferences, with 10 breakout rooms all on Zoom, right?
Yes, terrible times. People lost their lives, but on the flip side, it created an alternative ways of doing things. Yeah.
And it also shifted the mindset when people kind of found themselves alone, and I mean, in not moving, not being busy with the noise of life, just because everything sits still, even though they were still working, etc. And I think that brought up, even at personal levels, some reflections on what they were doing and the effect of their work, right? And their contribution to the world, I think, as well, much larger and at a personal level. So, Charles, before we close, I wanted to ask you, what would be, so you've been helping civil society now for a while, right? Strengthening their capacity, giving them tools, skill sets, etc. What would be your one recommendation to a small global south NGO? One recommendation that could help it could be the bouncing board for so much change for them.
I think it's about making sure that whatever you choose to do, it's relevant for the community that you serve. Not useful, but relevant. Focus on impact and let your mission drive you towards your impact. That's what I'll tell you.
Right. Yeah. Perfect closing words for our conversation, Charles. Thank you so much. So enjoyable. I think it's just the start of a conversation. We'll have another one, because it's such an interesting and hot topic right now, right? So and it's changing by the day, right? So in that sense, I think we need more conversations and to kind of spread that word about all the initiatives that are happening, what's really changing, and what are people doing around the world. So thank you so much for joining me. Lovely to have you on the podcast.
It's my pleasure, and thank you so much. I love what you're doing. I love the format. Keep on doing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of Rethink's Social Change podcast. I hope you got a lot of value and actionable insights from today's show. Would love if you take a minute to leave us a review. And if you work on social change and are up for the challenge, reach out. And before you go, be sure to subscribe so you're the first to know when we release a new episode. Till then, be the change.